Firstly, welcome to everybody. The background to this debate really starts with the fact that when I was doing a television program called Judge for Yourself, I noticed that there had been an exchange between Professor Alexander and Dr. Price relating to matters of affirmative action admissions and the whole gamut around the affirmative action issues with regard to tertiary education. And we had a half-an-hour debate, which was far too short. Well, that's because Mr. Copeland and Mr. Golding, who run ETV, won't give me more than a half an hour. Wrestling gets hours, but we intelligent debaters can only get a half an hour, which I suppose reflects the country. Anyway, the point about it was, whilst we were having this debate, we chatted about it and thought it would be a very good idea for us to bring this debate into the portals of the university where we all are, myself, Neville and Max, which is why we've done this. It appears that our panel is somewhat extended beyond the two, and that's fine, although that does constrain matters slightly. Let me tell you what the way we're going to run this. Each of the speakers I've asked to make an opening statement of around about 3 minutes, point being that one wants to try to get as much debate in as possible, starting with the Vice-Chancellor, Max Price, and then Professor Alexander, then the President of the SRC, Mr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, Professor Benatar, and Archbishop Njongonkulu, who will sort of be the last batsman. What will then occur is I will put some questions to them, and then we're going to open it up to you, hopefully in clumps of 3 or 4, so we can kind of keep the debate in a relatively coherent fashion. It has this disadvantage as compared to television, is that you can't edit anything out here. Anyway, without further ado, I call on Professor Price, Dr. Price.
Shall I speak from here?
If you want to, yeah, please.
No, I don't. People who know me know that 3 minutes is the most impossible task to set for me. What I'm going to take I think we should be moving the debate to a position beyond where it's been. And therefore, I just want to summarize briefly what I think is common ground. I think that it is common ground. I hope it is, but obviously that may become the debate. It is common ground that affirmative action is a good thing and that we should be doing it. That the society is unequal for various reasons. That some people have been born into circumstances which do not allow them to do as well at school as other people, and that to further compound and aggravate that inequality, that legacy of inequality, by saying that we will only look at your school results as the basis of admitting you into university, is simply adding insult to injury. And therefore that we need a form of affirmative action that recognizes disadvantage, makes allowance for that in some way in the admissions process, then adds intervention programs, academic development, etc., to ensure that those people, although admitted with lower marks, ultimately have a good success rate. I think that that's common ground, and that I don't have to defend affirmative action, but we'll see if the debate takes us there. What is not common ground is whether race is a good proxy for that disadvantage, and I suggest that we probably understand that debate and we might end up agreeing to disagree. I think from the research being done, race is a pretty good proxy. 90% or more of the people who are black in the country are poor, and vice versa, those who are poor are black. We should, and we are trying to find the direct measures of disadvantage, such as looking at people's income, looking at what schools they went to, looking at what early school educational opportunities they had. And if we could find those, and if we could measure them before people come to university at the time that they're applying, we might be able to do away with race as the measure or the proxy for disadvantage. And that would be a good thing, because we would like, I think again, common ground here, we would like to see what I call a non-racial society or a multiracial society. I know they're not exactly the same thing, but I would like to see both. And part of moving towards a non-racial society is a society that is colorblind, that doesn't think about people in terms of race, that doesn't require people to define themselves in terms of race as they have to do when they apply to universities, when you have an affirmative action policy based on race. We want to move away from all those things. The way to do that is to refine our measures of disadvantage. I actually think that's common ground and, in a way, the less interesting debate. We may, all that debate is about is whether we have those measures and why we don't have them, and technically can we find them. But here's where I think we should be also taking the debate further, and that is that if we were to take only people who currently are pretty advantaged, let's say the graduates of Rondebosch, Westerford and Bishops, and we were to say, well, here are students who have all had for 12 years educational advantage. They come from reasonable schools. We don't have to compensate for disadvantage anymore. Can we get rid of race in this group of students and just use their marks as the basis for selection? The consequence of that would be that almost only white, very few black students would get in if they were ranked. Because when you look at the distribution of performance in those schools, whites are right at the top end of that performance in matric, and black students are much lower. And we understand the reasons, we can debate that later, but compensating very substantially for the disadvantage by taking only people from privileged schools, you would find, ranking them on merit, choosing the top, you would get white students. Therefore, if we had a procedure, if we had an admissions process which excluded race and only looked at advantage or disadvantage, what we would find is that the disadvantage measure would draw in lots and lots of black students, but they would all be coming from disadvantaged schools and disadvantaged educational backgrounds. The rest would be largely white students, almost only white students. And we would end up with a profile of students on campus where white students are doing well, don't need affirmative action, pass first time in 3 years. Black students, almost to a person, because we're not going to get many black students from the privileged schools. Almost to a person, black students are going to be in affirmative action in academic development programs, taking longer to get through. The result is we will reproduce the stereotypes in society. We will reproduce views of racism. Black students are weak, white students are good. We will end up with classes which are actually segregated instead of integrated. Therefore, my proposition is that we have to explicitly go out and find the best black students that are out there in order to disrupt and those stereotypes that otherwise would exist, in order to make sure that we have lots of black students at UCT who are amongst the best students and who get through without any academic development and who are the same as white students. To do that, we have to find the most privileged black students, not the most disadvantaged black students. And in order to do that, we need a policy that includes race. We need to have race as a separate part of the basket, and we need to say we want the black students from Bishops. Those are our most desirable students.
Thank you very much. I want to start by saying that when I originally looked at the way in which this discussion was being structured, I was very concerned because it looked to me as though we're not taking this matter seriously, that people were given 2 minutes and so on. It's very obvious now from what the Vice-Chancellor has done that it's a bit more than 2 minutes. So perhaps we're a bit more serious about it. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is I want to explain what this is not about, because a lot of people have got quite a wrong conception of what this debate is about. It's not about my views versus the views of the Vice-Chancellor. On the contrary, we're talking about a very serious matter, different positions, not only these two positions, there are many other positions as well about this issue. And I think it's quite important to stress that. The third point I want to make is that we're talking about affirmative action, but actually we cannot isolate this whole issue of affirmative action from the much larger issue of what kind of South Africa we want to live in. I believe that we're asking the wrong questions because we are isolating in an Aristotelian way, we are isolating a specific issue and looking at it without reference to all the other interrelations that are involved. I believe we've got to start somewhere else. We've got to start by asking, what is the nature of the new South Africa? What kind of new South Africa do we want to live in? And we have to accept that when we talk about a non-racial, multicultural, multilingual, non-sexist, etc., South Africa, that this has various implications. Let me take one simple example. We talk about disadvantage. But disadvantage implies a norm. So the obvious question you've got to ask is, how was or is the norm constituted? And until you've got clarity on that, you cannot ask the right question. It's as simple as that. If the norm, for example, is whiteness or being white or white skin or whatever you want to call it, then it means that having a black skin is a disadvantage. No, I reject that. The fact that my skin is darker than somebody else's skin doesn't disadvantage me. And that is why, as the Vice-Chancellor said, we have agreement about certain things. For example, that it's not skin color, it's not so-called race that determines whether or not people are disadvantaged. There are other reasons. And if we speak about race as a proxy, if we say that 90% of people labeled black, notice I don't say classified or categorized, but labeled black. If we say that 9% of them are poor, why not use poverty? Why not use income as the relevant category instead of race? The reason I'm opposed to racial categorization, quite apart from some of the absurdities about which I hope in the discussion we'll have a chance to talk, the reason I'm opposed to it is that the implication of forcing people to categorize themselves or to be categorized by others, by functionaries, in racial terms, is that you entrench racial identity, race thinking, race prejudice. Anyone who doubts this, I ask you to go and read up the history of Rwanda, read up the history of Nazi Germany, amongst others, to see how systematic this particular process is. Don't be fooled by the fact that we have allegedly well-intentioned rulers at the moment. In 5 or 10 years' time, it may be very different. You may have a chauvinistic, black nationalist government which uses exactly the categories and the measures that you've been entrenching in order to cause major social conflict. And the fourth point, and for the moment the last, there are many more. Fourth point I want to make is that the universities have a mandate. We are an intellectual elite. I'm not suggesting that we are necessarily elitist. Elitism depends on what you teach, how you teach it, etc., etc. But we are privileged. And we are privileged also in intellectual terms. We have a mandate to challenge things that we know are, from a scientific position, wrong. Racial classification is wrong per se. Racial classification in post-apartheid South Africa is wrong for all the reasons that we know. And from that point of view, therefore, the university should rather make the effort, the intellectual effort, to find feasible ways of dealing with this matter. I have many more things to say. I just want to perhaps end up with one small thing. If you look at medical school, for example, not everybody has to be a doctor. If there's an insufficient number of places at the medical school, let us consider other ways of training people to become medically useful to the communities. Give a 4-year course, a barefoot doctor course, so that more people can be trained to go into the townships, go into the rural areas, work as doctors, get better qualifications, and eventually qualify as doctors. And in the meantime, take those who for the moment are best qualified to go into the medical field. I'm putting it very briefly for the moment, but I'll come back to these issues and many more issues as I say. You know, I believe we should have a series of workshops where we take up each of these central questions and work through them carefully. And I'm fully aware of the fact that this is not a new debate at UCT. But I think up to now, it's been simply a nominal, if you wish, genuflection to the debate. The real debate starts now.